The restaurant was filled with the soft clinking of silverware and murmurs of hushed conversations. The luxurious chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the tables, but the atmosphere was anything but warm for the young woman standing behind the bar. Her hands trembled as she placed a freshly poured glass of wine on the white linen tablecloth, barely noticing the man who had entered and taken a seat at the center table. He was tall, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, with a demeanor that screamed wealth and superiority. His cold eyes scanned the room, as if measuring the worth of each person. As he adjusted his cufflinks, the waitress couldn't help but notice the arrogance in his posture. She had dealt with many customers, but something about him made her uneasy. "Hey, you!" The man's voice cut through the low hum of the restaurant like a knife. "Come here." The waitress straightened her back, trying to suppress the nerves rising in her chest. She walked toward him, the sound of her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the anxiety creeping in. He didn't even look at her as he spoke. His eyes were fixed on the piano in the corner of the room, the grand instrument gleaming under the spotlight. "I know you're the waitress here," he said with a smirk, "but I'm in the mood for some entertainment. Play something. I don't care what it is, but play." Her eyes widened in surprise. She wasn't sure if he was joking or serious. The restaurant's policy didn't allow staff to entertain customers, and no one had ever dared to ask a waitress to perform. But there was something about his tone, sharp, dismissive, that left no room for argument. I'm not supposed to," she began, but he cut her off. "Do it now, or I'll have you fired," he sneered. The man's words hit her like a slap in the face. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Her mind raced, but all she could hear was the sound of his command echoing in her ears. She had worked too hard to lose this job, yet her dignity screamed at her to stand up for herself. But then, there was the piano. It had always been her escape. Her one true passion. She had been playing since she was a child, and though her job didn't allow her to show it, music had always been the place where she could truly breathe. It was the only thing that made her feel alive in this world of rules and expectations. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the grand piano. The man watched her closely, his eyes scanning her every move. As her fingers touched the ivory keys, she felt a strange wave of calm wash over her. She was doing this for herself. No matter how demeaning the request was, this was her moment. Her only chance to reclaim a bit of her own power. She started playing. At first, it was just a simple tune, a melody that had always brought comfort. But as the music flowed through her, she poured all her emotion into it. The anger, the hurt, the frustration, it all came out in a beautiful, powerful song that filled the restaurant. The man's smirk faded as the music took over. For a brief moment, it was as though he had forgotten about the power he had over her. His face softened, and he leaned back in his chair, captivated by the sound. But just as quickly as it came, the moment passed. He stood up abruptly, slamming his hand on the table. "That's enough," he barked, his expression turning from fascination to disdain. She stopped mid-chord, her fingers lingering on the keys for just a moment longer, as if defying him. She had done what he wanted, but not in the way he had expected. The tension in the room was palpable. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on her, waiting to see what she would do next. Would she shrink back in fear, or would she rise above the humiliation? But the real surprise wasn't in how the scene played out, it was in what came next. The rich man, who had expected her to cower, seemed taken aback by her defiance. His gaze lingered on her for a few moments, his usual smugness replaced by something else, something less certain. And then, without another word, he left. The moment he walked out the door, the weight of his presence seemed to vanish. The room returned to its normal rhythm, but the waitress was left in stunned silence. Her fingers still rested on the piano keys, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? She hadn't expected that. But deep down, something had shifted within her. She had stood up for herself in a way she never thought possible. And though the incident was over, the ripple effects would be felt long after. Little did she know, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The waitress sat quietly in the break room, her hands still trembling slightly from the unexpected encounter. She had been working at the restaurant for nearly 2 years now, ever since she moved to the city with high hopes of a fresh start. But life had a way of testing her resolve. It wasn't easy being far from her family, trying to survive on her own in a bustling city full of strangers. She had always dreamed of a career in music, playing the piano in front of an audience, but reality had a different plan. After graduating high school, her family's financial troubles had taken a toll on her ability to pursue her passion. Without a scholarship or the money to attend a prestigious music school, she had settled for a job in a restaurant, hoping that one day her big break would come. But the breaks always seemed to slip through her fingers. At night, after long shifts, she would sneak into the quiet corner of the restaurant where the grand piano stood. No one ever bothered her there, it was her sanctuary, her place to reconnect with the music that had always been a part of her. She would play for hours, the sound of the keys filling the empty space, letting the music heal her tired soul. It was the only time she felt truly alive, when her hands danced across the keys, playing pieces that brought her comfort. Yet, no one knew about her love for music. To them, she was just another waitress, taking orders and serving food, blending in with the crowd. She had become good at hiding her true self, afraid of being judged or mocked. But the mocking that day, what the rich man had said, was a different kind of hurt. It wasn't just the words, it was the power dynamic. His belief that he could command her to perform like an object, to entertain him on a whim, had dug into her pride. As she reflected on the incident, a sense of anger bubbled within her. How dare he speak to her that way? She wasn't a circus performer, a trained monkey to do tricks for his amusement. She was a person, with her own dreams, her own life, and her own worth. Yet, she knew she had allowed him to treat her as if she were nothing more than a servant. But, as the anger faded, something else took its place, determination. She had done something today that she hadn't done before, she had stood her ground, even in the face of humiliation. Playing the piano wasn't about impressing him. It wasn't about proving anything to him at all. It was about her, about reclaiming a piece of herself. It was a declaration, a way of showing that, no matter how much he tried to belittle her, he couldn't take away her love for music. She knew it hadn't been perfect. The moment had been awkward, forced, but it didn't matter. She had taken control of her own narrative, even if just for a brief moment. And as she walked out of the restaurant after her shift, her head held a little higher, she realized that something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just about standing up to him, it was about standing up for herself. The next morning, as she sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, sipping on coffee, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The rich man's face kept replaying in her mind, the way his eyes had narrowed, the way he had demanded she perform for him. She knew he probably thought little of the encounter. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a mere servant to be ordered around. But for her, it had meant something. She could have easily allowed it to crush her spirit. After all, it wasn't the first time she had been treated poorly. In fact, it wasn't the first time someone had tried to belittle her because of her job, her background, her race. But something about the way she had responded felt different this time. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, define her. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her mother, checking in on her. A simple, "How are you doing today?" but it made her smile. Her mother had always been supportive, always encouraging her to keep pushing forward, even when things felt impossible. She typed back, "I'm doing okay, Mom. Just taking it one day at a time." But deep down, she knew today was going to be different. She had taken a step towards reclaiming her power. And she wasn't about to let anyone take it away from her. The rich man, on the surface, seemed like someone who had it all. His tailored suits, his expensive taste, and the aura of confidence that surrounded him made him appear untouchable. People admired him from afar, believing him to be someone of great importance. But behind the polished exterior was a man who had built his life on a foundation of arrogance and control. He had been raised in wealth, never knowing a day of struggle. His father, a well-known businessman, had instilled in him the belief that power was the ultimate currency. As a child, he was taught that people were meant to serve him, not the other way around. It wasn't a lesson he consciously absorbed, but it was one he had come to live by. From an early age, he was conditioned to think of himself as superior to others. His friends were always those who could provide him with connections, with influence. He had been given everything he wanted, and in return, he had learned to treat the world around him as his playground. People, to him, were little more than tools or obstacles. They either served his needs or got out of his way. Throughout his adult life, this mentality had continued to shape his actions. He had gone on to inherit his father's business, expanding it and increasing his wealth. But with each success, his empathy had eroded a little more. He began to view those who worked for him, whether employees or service staff, as beneath him. To him, their job titles defined them, their worth predetermined. He didn't care to learn about their lives, their dreams, their struggles. All he saw were roles to be filled, services to be rendered. People were disposable, easily replaced when the time came. The restaurant was just another one of his favorite spots, a place where he often dined to impress colleagues or business partners. It was nothing personal, he had no particular animosity towards the staff. But when he walked into the restaurant that evening, something inside him had shifted. Maybe it was the wine, the lavish meal, or the way the pianist seemed lost in her own world as she played softly in the corner. But something about the waitress had caught his attention, and he hadn't been able to resist. In that moment, he hadn't even considered the impact of his request. His demand had been about power, not about music. He had seen her as an instrument, a performer who could entertain him. He didn't stop to think about her discomfort, her reluctance, or what it would feel like for someone to force her to play. It wasn't a request to him, it was an expectation. But something had happened after she played. When her fingers danced across the keys, something inside him stirred. The music, raw, unrestrained, and beautiful, had affected him in a way he hadn't expected. He had tried to dismiss it, tried to act as though he was above it all. But the longer he listened, the more he realized that he couldn't just shut it out. He had been struck by the power of what she had shared, something that transcended her role as a waitress and pierced through the wall he had built around himself. Yet even after the performance, he couldn't bring himself to admit that he had been moved. His pride wouldn't allow it. He couldn't allow himself to be vulnerable, to acknowledge that he had been touched by a woman who worked for him. So, he did what he always did when faced with discomfort, he lashed out. He stood up abruptly, demanded she stop, and walked out without a second thought. But the truth was, his actions had unsettled him. He didn't like to feel vulnerable. He had spent his entire life guarding himself from such emotions, from anything that could weaken him. But something about the way she had played, the passion in her fingers, the raw emotion in her music, had stirred something deep inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling, but he refused to confront it. Instead, he buried it, pushing it aside like he had with so many other uncomfortable feelings in his life. Later that night, after he returned to his mansion, he sat in front of his fireplace, staring at the flickering flames, deep in thought. The events of the evening kept replaying in his mind. He had told himself that he had only wanted a little amusement. After all, that's what people like him did, didn't they? They had the luxury of indulging in whatever they pleased. But the more he thought about the waitress, the more he wondered if he had crossed a line. He had a reputation to uphold. He couldn't afford to show weakness, especially not now. Yet, deep down, he felt an unexpected urge to understand her better, to know what had driven her to play so beautifully, despite the way he had treated her. But understanding people was never his strong suit. He had always kept his distance from those he deemed beneath him. And this waitress, this woman with the talent and courage to stand up to him, represented everything he had spent his life avoiding: vulnerability, human connection, and emotional depth. The rich man knew that something had changed within him that night, but he wasn't ready to face it. He was afraid of what it might mean, afraid that his carefully crafted world of control would begin to crumble. And so, he did what he did best, he ignored it, hoping it would fade with time. But the question remained, would he be able to ignore it forever? The days following the incident at the restaurant were filled with a strange sense of unease for the waitress. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her, something deep and unspoken, something that had been ignited the moment her fingers had touched the piano keys. It wasn't just the rich man's demand that had left an impression on her. It was the way she had refused to be humiliated, the way she had taken control of the moment, even if it was for only a few fleeting minutes. But now, in the quiet of her small apartment, the weight of the confrontation lingered in her mind. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. They had seen her deflect customers' rudeness with a practiced smile, but that night, after the rich man's departure, she had seemed different. When one of the other waitresses asked her how she was doing, the response was blunt, more so than usual. "I'm fine," she said, but the words didn't come easily. She didn't want to talk about what had happened. She didn't want to relive the embarrassment. But deep down, she knew that she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Her manager, who had seen the entire exchange from across the room, was silent for the next few shifts. It was rare for him to speak out of turn, but he had noticed the tension in the air and knew something wasn't right. Finally, he approached her after the dinner rush, his face unreadable. "Listen," he said softly, "I don't know what happened with that customer, but you've been a model employee. I'm not sure what the guy's deal was, but if he gives you any more trouble, you tell me. I'll have him removed, no hesitation. You deserve respect." She nodded, the words sinking in. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small gesture of solidarity that made her feel a little less alone. But the damage, she realized, had already been done. It wasn't the man's treatment of her that bothered her, it was her own reaction, the way she had allowed herself to be diminished in the first place. She had let him make her feel small. That night, she returned to the piano after her shift. She needed the familiar sound to clear her mind, to drown out the harsh memories and the nagging self-doubt. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, but as she began to play, her mind wandered back to the rich man. Had he realized how wrong he had been? Was he aware of how his actions had impacted her? Would he care? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she didn't know. And it frustrated her. She wanted to believe that he was capable of change, that he could recognize the cruelty in his behavior. But how could someone like him, someone who had never had to answer for his actions, ever understand? Meanwhile, across town, the rich man sat in his penthouse, his mood clouded with thoughts of the young woman he had humiliated. His mind kept replaying the moment when she had sat at the piano, her fingers moving effortlessly over the keys, her face focused, determined. The music had been hauntingly beautiful, and for the first time in years, he had been moved. But instead of acknowledging the rawness of what he had experienced, he had chosen to shut it down. He had dismissed it, and her, as easily as he had always dismissed others. But that night, as he sat alone in his office, the weight of his own arrogance finally hit him. The way he had acted toward her was inexcusable, and deep down, he knew it. He had used his power to degrade someone else for his own amusement, and he hated himself for it. Yet, as much as he wanted to apologize, to make things right, he found himself trapped by his pride. He had been the one to demand something from her. He had been the one to force her into a situation where she had to endure his mockery. But now, the thought of reaching out, of admitting he was wrong, filled him with dread. Would she accept his apology? Would she even care? The man spent hours pacing the floor of his penthouse, wrestling with his own pride and shame. It was a battle he was losing. His thoughts drifted back to the way she had stood there, her back straight, her eyes unwavering, as she had faced him with defiance. And, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, vulnerability. But just as quickly as it came, the vulnerability faded, replaced by the familiar armor of self-preservation. He couldn't let her see that side of him. He couldn't show weakness. The next day, as the waitress walked into work, her thoughts were a swirl of confusion. She hadn't seen the rich man since the night he had left, and she had no idea if he would come back to the restaurant. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. She wasn't sure she could handle another encounter, not after the way he had treated her. But another part of her felt curious about why he had acted the way he did, curious about whether he would ever come to realize the wrongness of his actions. As she entered the restaurant, her coworker met her with a hesitant smile. "Hey, guess who's back today?" he said, trying to keep his tone light. Her heart skipped a beat. The rich man. He had returned. The moment the rich man entered the restaurant, everything seemed to slow down. His presence, as always, filled the room with a mixture of tension and curiosity. People whispered, stealing glances at him, as he made his way to the same table he had occupied the last time. He looked different today, less self-assured, more contemplative. There was an almost hesitant air about him, one that was out of place for someone used to dominating every space he entered. The waitress could feel her pulse quicken. The thought of facing him again made her stomach churn. She had been trying to push the incident out of her mind, but now, seeing him there again, the memory rushed back. What was he doing here? Did he come to mock her again? Did he want to finish what he had started? But no. As the waitstaff went about their duties, there was something in his gaze that made the air feel different this time. He wasn't ordering with the same commanding tone he had used before. He seemed unsure. Uncertain. She was at the bar, filling a glass with water when one of the other servers leaned over and whispered, "He's asking for you." Her heart skipped a beat. It felt surreal. Why would he ask for her? Did he want to make another demand? Or had he come to make things right? Taking a deep breath, she walked toward his table, the familiar click of her heels against the floor echoing in her ears. The rich man looked up as she approached, his expression softer than she remembered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an awkward pause, as if neither knew how to begin. Finally, he cleared his throat and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit," he said, his voice much gentler than the tone he had used that night. Her instinct screamed at her to walk away, to keep her distance, but something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, made her hesitate. She had always believed in listening to her gut, and this time it told her to sit. So she did, cautiously lowering herself into the chair. I owe you an apology," he began, his words hesitant, as though he had never uttered them before. The rich man, the one who had demanded things from others his whole life, now seemed at a loss for how to speak. It was almost unnerving to see him like this, vulnerable, exposed. "I don't know why I said what I did the other night," he continued, his gaze dropping to the table. "I've treated people badly for a long time, but I don't know what came over me. I thought I could just," he paused, frustration and confusion evident on his face. "I don't know. Control everything. People. Situations. I guess I thought I could control you." She sat still, her hands gripping the edge of the table, unsure of what to make of his words. He was apologizing, but was he really sorry? Could someone like him truly change? Or was this just an attempt to ease his conscience after the guilt had eaten away at him? "I don't know what made me demand that you play," he said softly. "You were doing your job, and I treated you like an object. A tool for my amusement." He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a trace of genuine remorse. "That wasn't right. And I regret it. I can't take back what I said or did, but I can tell you that I was wrong." The waitress sat there in stunned silence, trying to process his words. She had imagined this moment in her head 100 times, wondering what it would feel like if he ever came back and apologized. But now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to respond. What did it mean for her? Did his apology even matter, or was it just another way for him to regain control? "I appreciate your apology," she said carefully, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. but it doesn't erase what happened. I'm not some entertainer you can just call upon whenever you feel like it. I'm a person. We're all people. She looked him in the eye, her voice strong now. I'm not something you can just demand and use when you feel like it. He nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was sinking in. He had spent so much of his life never having to face the consequences of his actions, but now, in front of her, he realized just how much he had taken people for granted. I understand, he said quietly. I do. And I want you to know that I'll never treat anyone that way again. There was a long pause between them. Neither spoke for several moments, both reflecting on the weight of the conversation. The waitress couldn't decide if his apology was genuine or just another act of self-preservation, but something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. Finally, she stood up. I have to get back to work, she said softly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned to walk away. But just before she reached the kitchen, she paused. And I hope you mean what you said, she added, her back still turned to him. Because people like you don't get to just make things right with an apology. It takes time. It takes effort. If you really want to change, prove it. She didn't wait for his reply. Instead, she walked away, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had stood her ground again, not just by refusing to be mistreated, but by demanding real change, not just words. As she went back to her duties, the rich man sat there in silence, contemplating her words. He knew she was right. Apologies were easy. But actions would be the true test. I appreciate your apology, she said carefully, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. But it doesn't erase what happened. I'm not some entertainer you can just call upon whenever you feel like it. I'm a person. We're all people. She looked him in the eye, her voice strong now. I'm not something you can just demand and use when you feel like it. He nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was sinking in. He had spent so much of his life never having to face the consequences of his actions, but now, in front of her, he realized just how much he had taken people for granted. I understand, he said quietly. I do. And I want you to know that I'll never treat anyone that way again. There was a long pause between them. Neither spoke for several moments, both reflecting on the weight of the conversation. The waitress couldn't decide if his apology was genuine or just another act of self-preservation, but something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. Finally, she stood up. I have to get back to work, she said softly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned to walk away. But just before she reached the kitchen, she paused. And I hope you mean what you said, she added, her back still turned to him. Because people like you don't get to just make things right with an apology. It takes time. It takes effort. If you really want to change, prove it. She didn't wait for his reply. Instead, she walked away, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had stood her ground again, not just by refusing to be mistreated, but by demanding real change, not just words. As she went back to her duties, the rich man sat there in silence, contemplating her words. He knew she was right. Apologies were easy. But actions would be the true test. The next few days at the restaurant felt different. The rich man returned, but his presence was no longer accompanied by the same air of superiority. He came in quietly, ordering his meal with a calm that was new to him. He no longer demanded, no longer saw himself as above the rest. The staff noticed the change, and so did the waitress, though she remained cautious. His apology had been unexpected, but she wasn't ready to forgive him completely, not yet. She could feel the weight of their last conversation still lingering in the air, but she couldn't quite figure out if the shift in him was genuine or just an attempt to smooth things over. He had apologized, but actions spoke louder than words. She had heard apologies before, but it was what followed that truly mattered. Her thoughts were interrupted when, during one of her shifts, she saw the rich man approach her again. This time, he wasn't sitting at his usual table. He stood in front of her, an unreadable expression on his face. She could feel her heart race as she waited for him to speak. "I know I haven't earned your trust," he began, his voice steady but tinged with an unspoken vulnerability. "But I'd like to try. To prove that I'm not the person I was. I want to make it right, not just with words, but with actions." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Actions speak louder than words," she said softly, echoing the sentiment she had expressed before. "If you're serious about changing, you'll have to show it." He nodded in understanding. "I know. And I'm willing to try." There was an awkward silence between them, both of them unsure of what to say next. She had never been one to trust easily, especially not after what had happened. But something about his tone, something about the way he stood there, waiting for her response, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he meant it. Over the next few weeks, the rich man continued to frequent the restaurant. He no longer made demands. He greeted the staff with respect, and his interactions with the waitress became less about power and more about mutual understanding. It was small progress, but progress nonetheless. He never expected anything from her, never tried to force her to play the piano again. Instead, he sat quietly, enjoying his meal, and when she came to his table, he treated her like a person, not an object. For the waitress, the change was both reassuring and unsettling. She could see that he was trying, but the road to redemption was long, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let go of her doubts just yet. She observed his every move, listening to his words, watching his actions. She had learned the hard way that words were easy, but actions were where the real truth lay. Then, one afternoon, the unexpected happened. The restaurant had an impromptu piano performance. One of the regular musicians had called in sick, and they needed someone to fill in. The waitress, who had always been hesitant to share her talent with others, was asked to step in. At first, she hesitated. The thought of playing in front of a crowd, of making herself vulnerable again, made her stomach twist. But then, she remembered the piano in the corner of the restaurant, the place where she had first found solace, where she had reclaimed a small piece of her soul. It was time to stop hiding. She agreed to play, and as her fingers touched the keys, she felt the familiar rush of peace that had always accompanied her music. The notes flowed effortlessly, as though they had always been there, waiting to escape. The crowd was captivated, but for the waitress, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about reclaiming her passion, her strength. As she played, she could feel eyes on her. The rich man was watching from his usual seat, and for the first time since their initial confrontation, she wasn't worried about what he thought. She played for herself, for the freedom it brought her, for the part of herself that had been silenced for so long. The music became her release, her declaration that she would never let anyone take away her dignity again, no matter how powerful they were. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. She looked up and saw the rich man standing, clapping slowly, a look of genuine admiration on his face. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who had humiliated her, but as someone who had come to understand the power of human connection. After the performance, he approached her quietly. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You are so much more than you know. And I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner." She smiled, the tension in her chest easing just a little. She didn't need his approval, but hearing his words felt like a small validation, a recognition of her worth that she had never received before. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's just who I am." And with that, something shifted between them. It wasn't an immediate forgiveness, but it was a step toward understanding. A small bridge was being built, one brick at a time. It would take time, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something new. For both of them. The restaurant had become a different place for both of them. The dynamics between the waitress and the rich man had shifted in subtle, but profound ways. There were no grand gestures, no sudden transformations, but the quiet changes spoke volumes. He was no longer the arrogant, entitled man who used others for his own amusement. And she, though still cautious, had begun to see him as more than just the man who had humiliated her. He was someone who was trying to change, even if that change was slow and imperfect. One evening, as the restaurant buzzed with its usual activity, the rich man approached the waitress again. This time, there was no awkwardness between them, no hesitance. It was as if they had both reached a quiet understanding, a space where they could be human, without the walls of power or pretense. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice sincere, but softer than it had ever been. "Not just for the music you shared with us, but for showing me what I needed to see." She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What's that?" "That people, real people, not the ones in my world of business and wealth, have more value than I ever realized. I thought I could buy respect, buy control. But you showed me that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn." Her heart shifted at his words, and she knew that, in this moment, he wasn't just apologizing anymore. He was truly understanding. The apology was no longer a defense mechanism, it had become a recognition of the truth. And in that truth, there was a freedom for both of them. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the layers of anger or resentment. She saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he had worked so hard to conceal. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The rich man wasn't someone who could just snap his fingers and change overnight. But here, with her, he had learned a lesson that had taken him a lifetime to understand. "I think that's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say," she said softly, her tone reflective. "And I think you're right. Respect can't be bought. It has to be earned. But it's not just about how you treat people you think are beneath you. It's also about how you treat yourself." He nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I've spent so much time thinking I had to be above everyone, thinking that's what made me worthy. But now I see that the real strength comes in recognizing that we all have something valuable to offer." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of realization. The waitress had always known that worth wasn't something you could measure in money or status. She had lived it every day, struggling to make ends meet, but never compromising her sense of self. And now, the rich man was beginning to see that, too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic promises. The silence between them was one of understanding, of growth. They had both come a long way, though they still had far to go. But the journey they had started was no longer one of conflict or struggle. It was one of mutual respect. As the evening drew to a close, the rich man stood up from his table, ready to leave. He looked at the waitress one last time, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I hope you know I mean it." She nodded, a small but genuine smile forming on her lips. "I do. And I think you'll keep proving it, one day at a time." He gave her a brief smile in return, before walking out into the night, the restaurant's door closing softly behind him. She watched him go, her mind filled with a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of closure, not because she had forgiven him completely, but because she had learned to let go of the anger that had once defined her. In the days that followed, the rich man's behavior remained consistent. He didn't rush to make up for everything he had done. Instead, he took slow, steady steps, proving with each action that he was committed to change. He treated everyone with respect, not just because he was trying to gain favor, but because he had finally understood that respect was not a commodity, it was a fundamental part of human connection. For the waitress, it wasn't about forgiving him right away. It was about understanding that change was possible, but it was never instant. It was the small steps, the daily choices, that made the difference. And as she moved forward in her own life, she carried that lesson with her, that we all have the ability to change, no matter where we start from. But real change comes from within, and it is built on the foundation of respect, humility, and understanding. And so, the story of the rich man and the waitress ended not with a grand reconciliation, but with a quiet understanding, a mutual recognition that both had been changed by the encounter. The lessons they had learned weren't just about the importance of respect or the value of change, they were about the power of human connection. And in the end, it was that connection that had the power to heal and transform them both.